Hello, everybody. This is Sarah Collado of Architecture Talk Tongue. Today's a special one because I'm actually coming together with other podcasters and I'm extremely excited for it. I'm super curious about the story. And so today I'm being joined by Maria and Emily from Open Plan Podcast. And in fact, both of them are architects and they decided to come together and sort of grow on their friendship and love for architecture and create a podcast. And you can, in fact, tune into it on iTunes. And I'm sure many other platforms will get into it in this episode. But I'm super curious to know a little bit about the friendship and also the project and to just find out more about Maria and Emily. So let's dive right into it. Well, girls, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us. We're super excited.
Thanks for having us.
It's awesome. So let's just start with the beginnings. Like, how do you guys know each other first and foremost?
Do you want to say it?
Yeah. We met in grad school. So we both went to Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta for grad school. And we met maybe within the first semester in some class or studio. I can't even pinpoint exactly. But
I don't remember the exact day we met at all.
But
we didn't have any studios together. Fun fact. Yeah. You knew of each other. Yeah.
And then we just knew of each other. We weren't really that close until pretty much like the summer that we had internships close by in the city. And we also lived close by. So we ended up kind of walking to the internship together, like walking in the morning. We were working at different firms, but they were really close together. So we would take walks in the morning.
Get our steps in.
If we had time, we'd sometimes get coffee before work, but usually we were running late. So we're just trying to get to work. But it was a nice like 30-minute walk together. And then when we could align our schedules, we walked back together too. And we just got really close after that. And actually during those walks, we've both been into podcasts, for the longest time. So we would talk about how there wasn't really a podcast about architecture or about what we were going through at the time, like new professional, like young, just coming out of school or still in school, doing exams and figuring out what to do with your life type of content. A lot of the podcasts that we knew of in architecture were a lot more towards like a older audience or like a more professional take. And we were more interested in someone we could relate to. And so we would joke about creating our own podcast someday if we had the time, like in grad school. We could never have done it. But yeah, so that's kind of where the seed was planted.
And I feel like the pandemic kind of kickstarted it because all of a sudden we didn't have like places to go out or like places to travel to as much. So we were like, let's start this podcast project. Like, let's actually do it. And we were living near each other. So we were just recording at each other's houses and honestly using it as an excuse to just hang out with each other. And the mic was just kind of there. So whenever you listen to one of our podcasts, it's very candid, very casual. It's really just Marie and I as friends, just revealing our real experiences and hopefully being relatable to other people starting out in the industry.
Absolutely. So in fact, I do want to deep dive a little bit and kind of go on a walk with you coming back from that from that work home, because I think that that's really where the first conversation started. So tell me, what would you mostly talk about? Like, I'm sure there was a little bit of like complaining about maybe a little bit of like disappointments or realizing, what it really is like to work and the differences between that and your education. So tell me a little bit more about that, because I think that that's really what sparked this project, and it must have been sometimes even more interesting than like the content that ended up being created, because it's like this beginnings of when you're finding out and you really go through the emotions too.
The unfiltered.
We should have recorded the walks.
Well, there you go. I feel that that's really that was where the podcast was, really.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, we both were doing our internships in the city of Atlanta and just talking about our own experiences. Like I was in a bit of a smaller firm, Maria was in a big firm, talking about what projects we were working on. We were both actually doing healthcare projects. So just like funny stories about like how we're getting along with people in our internship, like whether we're busy, like whether we were feeling like we were being, actively engaged during the internship, because we definitely would complain of each other days, like, oh my God, like this project's on hold, what am I doing here type of thing. And a lot of it was also like we were taking actually the lead Green Associate exam. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the lead, you probably are, but like we were starting out and we were like, it'd be so great if there was a podcast we could listen to and just like test content. And we were studying for it and we were kind of like scrounging around, like looking for content. And we are like, it'd be so nice if there was just like something you could listen to while working. And that was like a podcast idea. Like we have a podcast on that now. But yeah, just like day-to-day life of being an intern, and some funny stories, like the site visit story, Maria, where it was like all girls. Remember that?
Yeah. I think there was a lot of comparison of like, hey, like I'm doing this thing, like, have you done this before? How did you go about it? Or like, oh, this situation happened where, I was in the meeting and I didn't understand anything they were saying, and there were 20 people there and I was like a fly on the wall, and like different situations like that. And I like site visits too. Like there was one site visit that I went to that was all women. It was my project manager was a woman, and the like project architect was a woman, and I was like the intern working on that project, and they took me along obviously for the experience. And obviously, the general contractor is on site, and he's just like making fun of us and like asking me how much I make and all this, crap about being intern and a woman. And oh my God, like I can't believe women are telling me I did my job wrong, So that was like, it was actually great because most people have the opposite experience where they're the only woman in a site, especially a young woman in the business. So I was grateful for that experience. And I think Emily had pretty good role models in that first internship too. And we were fortunate enough for that. But it was a lot of like talking about each of our experiences and comparing and seeing what you're learning and what I'm learning, and learning from each other too. I think that was also like something that was very beneficial to both of us. We're almost experiencing two different internships in one.
Totally. I actually quite like that you spoke about this woman aspect and shared that story, because something that I've been recently finding out as I was organizing the Disrupt Symposium for Women Edition, I asked some friends that are doing surveys within the AEC industry to share some statistics, and I actually found out that there is almost 50-50 division between men and women going into the industry today, which definitely wasn't the case in the past. So it's quite interesting that you guys being slightly younger and a younger generation, you have more of that experience of being surrounded by women, whilst perhaps the older generations are still living within that narrative of being a minority within a working environment. So I'm almost curious to ask, how do you feel that influenced you as young architects already? You spoke of these women being role models and for it to be a very good experience, but is there any specific takeaways that you can share from that?
I think that you're right in the sense of like we feel the responsibility and like the load that there is on women in the profession, how we have to try twice as hard, and we're super careful about not making mistakes, and just all these things that I feel like men don't even think about. But we do have a whole generation of women that came before us that are kind of setting the path, and that's kind of like what we use to reason why we are in there in the first place. What I feel is that I belong, but it's harder, like I deserve to be here. So it's not that I feel like the women before us didn't even feel that they deserve to be there. So that layer has been kind of established by this previous generation. And now we're like, okay, we deserve to be here. Everybody knows that. So let's all get on the same page and respect each other and bring up women and give women jobs and pay them equally, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's like following the footsteps of this previous generation, but there's still so much to do still.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Any thoughts, Emily?
Yeah. I feel fortunate that I've had a couple of female bosses now, and it's been really nice to learn from them. And I think as women, we're not always as outspoken or as ready to in project meetings, for example, kind of, become not combative, but we're seen as combative if you're outspoken. And it's been a nice example to see more women bosses and seeing how they kind of command the attention of a room and the meeting. And she's been giving me the opportunity to do the same thing recently, kind of shifting into that like middle management part of my career where I'm like learning to be a project manager, things like that. And typically the old me found that so intimidating, and I had very bad imposter syndrome starting out in the industry, just because even though there was a lot of women in education, for sure, there's a lot of women in our architecture classes, I did feel working in a firm environment, I was still one of the few women in my firm, and it wasn't the education to firm thing didn't translate. And I feel like that's like a typical thing where a lot of women drop out of architecture or like, don't pursue it just because of it's not really conducive to having a family a lot of the times. And a lot of people are afraid of that. But yeah, so early on in my career, I did notice that I was, sometimes one of the only women in the room during a meeting, especially I'm in transportation. So it's very engineering focused. And still, the other day I was the only girl in the room. And I sometimes catch myself thinking about it. And then like, as soon as I start talking and like realizing that I have something important to say, like, I'm like, I don't think anyone else is noticing that right now. And it kind of gives you like the power back a little bit. Cause like you get in your head, you're like, oh my gosh, everyone's going to notice that, I'm like younger than everyone. I'm a woman here. But as soon as you're like, you know what, I know what I'm talking about. And then the room kind of just shifts. Yeah. I had this exact moment like last week where I was like, I don't know why I'm here, but here I am.
So that's really interesting. And I love how you spoke to, this imposter syndrome thing. We all feel it. What do you feel like you needed from your environment, especially within the work setting, to feel more comfortable and to take a little bit more leadership, perhaps?
The number one thing I recommend women to do is get licensed. For me, that skyrocketed not only my career, but my confidence that I was able to pass these exams and that I do have technical knowledge in architecture. And no one can take that away from you. She got her license. She's a licensed architect. So that in itself speaks for itself whenever you enter a project and you have that. So that I think was probably the number one thing that even today, I still have imposter syndrome all the time. It's not solved, but like having that license definitely helped. And I recommend, doing the same thing if you're feeling that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think that it's important to find your own way in which you can validate your efforts. And at the end of the day, like architecture is not an easy education path. We do invest like 7 years to be able to even get to the point of licensure. And then of course you get into practice, you start working, and there is just so many more challenges. And I think specifically within my platform, I speak a lot to business education, which obviously is lacking at university. And we are kind of stepping into internships and practice to learn about it. But sometimes we are also squished into roles of working within software, CAD monkeying around, doing a lot of drafting, and that sort of stuff. And I think that perhaps that education within practice is somehow diluted. And so people perhaps don't feel good enough, or they don't feel encouraged to step up to leadership roles. But you did share with me that you are now going through training into a more managerial position. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, in full transparency, there's definitely growing pains into it. It's not comfortable at all. And I feel like there's always that period, even as an intern or before you start any new phase of your life. There's like some bumps along the way, but I'm lucky in that I'd mentioned that I have a pretty great female boss or manager who is very open with me asking her questions. And that's one thing I recommend, is just constantly ask questions and don't be afraid to. So yeah, it's been going well. Like I think I really enjoy it. It does fit with my brain, like right hand kind of organizational brain. I told Maria this before too. I find myself more comfortable in that than just being the drafting, CAD monkey detailing person. And for some people that's great and they thrive in that. And, it's necessary. And I do like details to some extent, but I am enjoying kind of shifting to a bigger picture role of managing, coordination, different disciplines, and running project meetings. So yeah, it's definitely kind of forced me into more communication related, learning how to write a good email, learning how to conduct a good meeting and keeping it short. And yeah, it's been good. Hopefully more to come.
I love it. That's tremendous. And Maria, what happened in your life and career life since the internship walks with Emily?
I miss Emily. She needs to move back.
I know. Oh yeah, we're long distance friends now.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this project keeps you together.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I actually kind of took a detour from architecture during COVID, just, in 2021. I actually went to work at an architecture firm, but as a marketing manager. So I didn't touch CAD or Revit or anything for a year, which was lovely. But yeah, so I learned a lot about marketing, just pursuing projects and positioning the firm to get more projects and all that stuff. And that was really interesting and something I've always been into, partially like the graphic design side, but also the social media marketing, public image side of the company. But then eventually I kind of missed architecture a little bit, like marketing wasn't enough. But I still wanted to do both to some extent. So I went to a different firm, actually a woman-owned firm that's like 90% women, which is very different from everyone else's reality, but it's cool. And she wanted me as this hybrid role. So I'm maybe like 25% marketing and 75% architecture. It's a small firm, so I just do all their marketing, anything that's marketing related, it's me. So it's a nice balance. And it's also a very design heavy firm because it's so small. I'm actually getting to design a lot more than I've ever had before, which is also intimidating because I feel like being the designer of a project, even if this project is small, is still a lot of responsibility, and that every decision comes down to you. So it was funny because like within I think like my first 3 months or something, I asked like, oh, like what color are we painting this wall? And they're like, I don't know, what color do you want to paint it? And I was like, me? I don't know. I was like, I have to pick the color. So it was a little bit of a learning curve because I was used to working at big firms, is mostly doing production work, and I've never had to answer that type of question. So it was really it was a shock, but now I'm really enjoying it because it's I'm being able to design under obviously supervision of someone more experienced, but it's still exposing me to these things, which is really fun. And then not missing the marketing side too, because I'm growing on both sides. So
I love this. And I actually love that sort of diversification that you took into marketing. How did that transition feel? I mean, you said that you wanted to move away from CAD and you were interested naturally in marketing. So I'm sure when passion, drags you somewhere, that's a nice feeling. But sometimes when you leave architecture, it feels like, you walking away from an identity you created.
yeah,
Really, it's a whole thing
no.
within our group, I guess, or fraternity, if you can say, of architects. Leaving even for a short period of time feels like perhaps your CV is going to suffer, or you will no longer get a job, or because you've continued being an architect for some time. So how did that feel?
So it was more about where I was coming from, I think, because so during COVID, I didn't get the job that I had lined up after school because everything, people stopped hiring. And I ended up working or just taking a job that was pretty much the only job I could find at a firm that I didn't really connect with. I was there for maybe 6 or 7 months in 2020, and I was just trying to find a way out, to be quite honest. So I was pretty open to anything really, like anything related to architecture that I felt like I could bring value to. And it just so happened that it was a firm that I already knew, and a friend of mine from school was working there, and she mentioned that they were looking for someone to do marketing. And so I basically faked it until I made it.
Oh.
And I had no real education or experience in marketing. So, but actually, the podcast was a huge
I was just gonna say.
thing on my resume that we had done it for almost a year at that point. And so, I was able to use that as like an argument to say, hey, like I'm doing all these things on the side, and like I've done graphic stuff for student organizations in school. So I think part of that, part of selling myself to get this marketing job was like the whole marketing effort in and of itself. And I was able to kind of convince them that I could do that job, even though it was really scary because I hadn't done like proposals or anything like that for a legit firm. So, and then that transition, since I was coming from a place where I was really unhappy, it was very like a release. Like it felt like a complete thing that came out of my back, like a weight lifted, that I just couldn't deal with it anymore. Like I really just needed a break from architecture, I think. And I was out for a year, and what made me come back was the fact that I didn't see myself doing my whole career in marketing. So I thought, okay, if I stay in marketing, if I stay here for too long, it means that that's now like the path that I'm on. And the longer I stay out of architecture, the harder it's going to be to come back. So I did it for a year. I did my best, and they were happy with what I did. So I didn't completely, screw it up. But
Yeah.
then it was kind of a decision that I made in terms of like, what do I want long term? And I didn't want to do marketing alone. So, and that opportunity came about kind of along the same time that I was thinking about making a change.
Sure. I mean, I think something that, sounds good to me is the fact that you kind of had that experience also with client acquisition and going after projects. You mentioned that part of the job, description or responsibility was to use marketing in order to position the firm and attract clients. And I think that that's just a tremendous experience from a business perspective as you move forward within your career, whether, as an employee or also being trained to managerial roles. Eventually that sort of responsibility of also client acquisition will fall on your shoulder, and you'll already have that experience. Because what I find, is that people are absolutely clueless where projects are coming from very often. And sometimes
they actually make money. Yeah.
How does the firm actually get the clients, in the projects? Like architects that are not responsible for client acquisition oftentimes are just like servicing the clients and doing their job without actually like fully understanding where and how to land projects like this. And so I think that it makes it ever so harder to imagine yourself ever like, get in the driver's seat and say, okay, I want to start my own business now and I know what to do, right? Because it just feels so hard and so new that people are perhaps not even allowing themselves to think about doing that. So I guess it's time to talk a little bit about the podcast. I asked you both about your careers, and I know that the podcast is about that. So I'm guessing that since you guys started, it kind of evolves around that journey that you just shared with me. And you did mention how, how of a great benefit it is actually to run something like that on the side as a personal passion project, because it does ties into personal brand creation, thought leadership, and also giving value to people, within our industry, other architects. But tell me a little bit more about the actual podcast.
Yeah. Go ahead, Emma.
I was like, we have to like bounce back and forth. I was like, which one? Yeah, so the podcast is essentially, we call it a lifestyle and architecture podcast because while it is definitely focused on architecture and design, we like to bring in life experiences that go outside just the normal architecture design realm. So you'll hear us talking about things like our first internships. We have I think one of our early episodes is very raw, like our good and bad from early internships and our experiences with that. We get very personal with it, and outside that, with like career stuff, we'll talk about ways to decompress, what to do when you feel burnout, and that kind of shifts some more of the lifestyle kind of side of the podcast. At the same time, we want to create content that's valuable to everyone, that stuff we wish we knew. So we'll also get into, things like the lead green associate exam. And recently, it kind of parallels what we're going through at the same time. So I just took the architecture registration exams. So we've been releasing kind of episodes for each of the exams and what exactly to study, just because it's like fresh in my head and like I wrote everything down when I was taking them. So yeah. And then, something similar career-wise was when Maria kind of went into marketing. We had a whole episode of me interviewing Maria and what it was like to be in marketing and architecture. So there's really no like script for what we talk about. It definitely is a theme of architecture, but we also include like a catch-up segment between me and Maria in the beginning, so people kind of get to know us and our stories, and it's not just kind of, let's get right to business, because that's just not really us. So
the whole point, the reason why we wanted to make our own, or like the lack of podcasts that were relatable, is because we want to make it seem like, not make it seem, but like show that we actually are normal people. We have lives. Emily was wedding planning. Now I'm wedding planning, and it's hard to coordinate that with having a full-time job and studying, like just real. I love one of our really early episodes is about love and architecture, because my fiance is also an architect and Emily's husband is not. So It was really interesting to see the different like relationship dynamics of that. And then just like there's one about like home decor and like how we make our spaces better, and like small apartment, like little things like that are just part of our universe. And we feel like we can add value because we're who we are. I think that also has really connected with people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love it because actually I feel that anything in personal career, moving forward from university is very much a big journey to self-discovery and becoming like your authentic self. And I think today with, the rise of internet, we're certainly exposed more and more, and through podcasts to this idea of like, who is your authentic self, and like, why is it important to create a brand around it and bring that sort of humanized approach into brands. And we certainly observe a lot of even bigger architecture firms like honing into more a humanized approach. I certainly hosted like SOM at the Disrupt symposiums that have been doing a lot within their communications and marketing to actually tell stories of people that worked for them. And and so I think we see that shift, and I think something that really speaks to me and I really, really like within that story is the fact that in a way you say, oh, the fact that we are architects makes us unique because we see the world differently, we see relationships differently, we sort of maneuver through everyday lifestyle things and challenges in a different way because we're architects. We react to them differently, and part of it is funny, part of it is weird, but it kind of is relatable. And I love the fact that you guys honed into it as you created that project, and also somehow put a mark within the world of like, well, this is Maria and this is Emily and this is who we are, and that's a story, and we owed our stories and put it out there. So this is amazing. We kind of talked a little bit about how that sort of podcasting has influenced potentially getting jobs and things like that, but what other benefits come from having that podcast?
Well, I mean, Maria, I'm like kind of saying it for you, but it literally opens the doors to jobs. We literally interviewed Maria's boss, or from now current boss, but the time was not her boss. And I feel like, obviously she did know of Maria before. We had met her at Georgia Tech, but I think just things like that, it kind of brought her back into your universe, into like, on her radar. And I think, I'm pretty confident she listened to Maria's episode and was like, wow, this girl knows what she's talking about. And, I'm sure it helped majorly. And like,
it was literally started. Like, she just listened to me talking about stuff that she would ask me in an interview if she was interviewing me for a job. So it was all done. It's done. It's there. But another thing, like you mentioned, we interview people. We bring different people into the podcast. So I think that's also something that has brought a lot more value than we even imagined. Like we interviewed friends, we interviewed professors that we know, or people that we got to know after starting the podcast. And like doing this with you, you just connect with other people that you would have never known. So I think we've gained a lot of value in that too. And just like creating this community, like we really wanted to also develop, it's a hard balance to like, okay, we want to make a podcast, we also want to have like an Instagram or something that can hold these people and we can talk to people, because podcasting is very like one way. There's not like comments or anything. So the Instagram page has been like, when we don't have time to record, we'll just post a little bit more on there and talk to people through there. And that's also been a really good place where like we generate some study content, some test content there, and have a dialogue with people. And it's also a way to get their temperature. Like, what are they interested in? What do they like about the fact that which are their favorite episodes, or what's their most relatable content that they like to listen to? So
I love that you brought up the Instagram, because that's probably one of my favorite parts, is just interacting with our community, because sometimes we record and you really forget how many people listen. And it's really rewarding when someone DMs you and is like, oh, I like really like this episode, like thank you for this content. And it kind of is like, oh wow, like we enjoy doing it, but it's like extra nice when like other people are like appreciative of it, and it makes it like a fun back and forth. And like as Maria said, meeting other podcasters. We've been on a couple other podcasts as well, and I actually met up with one of them in California. And it's just, it's cool to create like a little community, whether it's with other podcasters or just, people around the world like listening, which we can't wrap our heads around all the time. We look at our stats like, wow, there's people in like, the UK listening. There's people like, outside the US, Brazil. Maria has a fan base. So it's been really rewarding, and we just want to, make friends.
And one more thing, I love that it's like completely unrelated to our jobs. We can do it whenever we can. There's no like, we're not anal about a schedule or anything. It's just whenever we have time, we do it.
Like a hobby.
Yeah. And that's actually something that I wanted to kind of use as my next question, because you drove this golden word and being a podcaster and sort of almost, I call myself a full-time content creator. Sometimes it's actually like hard to fall into those expectations of actually creating content regularly because of algorithms and social media and following and whatever. And, there's certainly a lot of podcasters that will record in a manner that they do the audio separately, and they do like, let's just say the full season, and then edit it and upload it on iTunes all regularly and stuff like this. How do you guys go about that? So you did mention that sometimes you don't have time for recording. So is it not a regular podcast?
It's not.
Yeah.
Welcome to the not regular podcast.
Yeah, we established that kind of early on with the people's expectations that like this is really going to be when we can, but we will try to interact over Instagram, and we appreciate people following along, and we want to put out valuable content. So we don't want to just record for the sake of recording and kind of just talk, which we probably could do that. And, but we really do plan our episodes out and really think about them. So when we do release it, it's like, we want it to be like an intentional thing. So
absolutely. And I think that's important, because it's kind of, I find that sometimes if I am to create content or share a story that comes directly from my personal life, it's not just me showing up and telling that story, but I need to think about the context and like, what are the takeaways? You really have to like prepare, how to present it, because otherwise you just, I don't know. It's just kind of,
it's hard.
Yeah.
And so I do kind of respect the amount of preparation and thought that goes into this content ahead of time. And certainly now I've been trying myself more and more with articles. I've always loved writing, but I've been doing much more writing recently. And that is also that sort of process of like planning and thinking and preparing and re-editing and editing down, and even posting articles takes so long. And so actually it's a whole process. But in comparison, I've had this podcast for about 2.5 years, and it's never regular. In fact, we show up whenever guests book in. So it's like, this is our just call in a calendar.
Yeah, speaking our language.
Yeah, but I have a system of how like I take breaks between recordings, and then on iTunes it goes out regularly because I just thought iTunes would be worth to grow. And much like yourself, I'm always surprised about like seeing how, for example, I've always been surprised that there's been quite a lot of listeners from Turkey. Like, you know, like I've been there maybe at university once visiting Istanbul, but yeah, it's surprising that people discover you from parts of the world that you don't even travel to so much.
We have listeners in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
our third most listened to country. I don't understand.
Yeah, Turkey
Shout
is
out Egypt.
ranking really, really high, and it's like, wow. I mean, yeah. I do mostly promote to America and Europe, so it's also surprising that within the iTunes sort of algorithm or whatever, like people
Right.
discover it from the like on their own. It's not my marketing of the podcast.
Right.
It's
Yeah,
actually
it's like recommended to them, or and that's kind of the nice thing about having architecture as our niche, that while it is not that large of a group of people, there's only a limited amount of podcasts. So I feel like it's kind of nice that like when you've heard of one, you probably heard of a couple. Like there's like a circle of us, and it's not really like that many. So if you're listening, it's like, yeah, people know. So it's like community a little bit.
Yeah, and especially if you also have like a age group, you know, of people that you're normally speaking to. I certainly feel like people that follow me and listen to my content are mostly in their 30s and 40s. Sometimes older, but very rarely younger. I mean, we do have students coming to the events, but I feel mostly people in my age category. And I like that because, of course, I want to also interact and always imagine speaking to people that are my age. So I relate to that more. So I think that's also by attraction what attracts the audience to you as well. We've had a few comments. Daniel is saying how we mentioned about the fact that there is more women coming into architecture, and he's asking, how would you explain the rising number of women in architecture in comparison to men? It's an interesting question. I don't really know how to answer it, but what do you guys think?
Like that there's more women coming into the profession.
Yeah. Why do you think that would be?
I mean, I think part of it could be because there's more women architects that are now serving as examples and role models. You know, there is very little, but there are a few movies with women that are architects, you know, like in pop culture.
Yeah.
I think it's slow, but it might be getting better. I feel like you know, everyone knows who Zaha Hadid is, I guess. So like she's the main, you know, woman architect that most people know, even the people that are not into architecture, maybe. So I think that plays a huge role. Like part of it is just knowing that architecture is an option. I think that it historically is seen as like similar to engineering, where it's like a dude thing.
Yeah, that's right.
It's, you know, you have to know a lot of math, which is not true. You have to know how to draw, which is also not true. Like
debunk all that.
So yeah, I think that is probably one of the bigger factors.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, and in general, I think women are just getting more and more educated as the years go on. The number, I think, of women in college has surpassed men, I want to say, when I last saw, as far as who's enrolling. So I think, you know, as the number of women in the workforce grow, naturally that there are just going to be more women in architecture, which I love to see.
Absolutely.
And maybe they're also starting to be more valued in the profession. Like being a woman architect is better now than it was 50 years ago.
Absolutely.
So it's a more attractive field, you know.
I think that also, despite the fact that it has that sort of association with engineering and maths, I think that people within the mainstream, let's just say, understanding of architecture can also picture it being a very creative and, you know, perhaps like a little bit, I don't want to say more ambitious, but a little bit more like an interior design class, because you can actually move walls and imagine spaces and build from scratch, which is a nice skill to have, I think. Interior design and fashion is very like design and colorful and creative. I think women were attracted to that throughout generations more, whilst architecture was more that sort of blogs thing. Whilst
Yeah.
now I think that perhaps it's becoming an extension of some of those creative industries, but just a way for us also to do bigger things, greater things. So we are running closer towards the end of this podcast. I wanted to ask you, where do people find you first and foremost? As if they discover you perhaps through this, where do they go to find your podcast?
So our Instagram is at Open Plan Podcast, and you can find our episodes on Spotify, iTunes, all the other ones. We have like a feed that goes to everywhere. And it's just called Open Plan Podcast. And we have a website, openplanpodcast.com. You can listen there too, where we have our podcast descriptions. And yeah, follow us on Instagram and talk to us. Tell us
you're here. Yeah, tell us who sent you.
Yeah, that's right. And just before you go, since your podcast and sort of the way that we manage this conversation as well is very lifestyle, what's next for both of you?
What's next? Yeah, so I guess life-wise,
personal life, it can be something from career, but what are we tuning into as we're following the future episodes?
Yeah, good question. For me, we recently bought an old home from the early 1900s, so we're renovating that.
Excellent.
And hopefully moving in this summer. So really getting into the fun part of renovation where I'm actually picking out tiles and finishes and gotten past all the HVAC stuff. So like now I'm seeing the home. So that is front and foremost for me, what's coming up.
Yeah, we definitely should make some episodes about that. And
before
and after
101.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, I'm getting married in July.
Amazing.
I'm going.
Love and Architecture Part 2.
Yeah.
2.0.
We always joke we're gonna do a live, I'm like listener
live of the wedding.
Yeah.
But other than that, I think once we get through that process, I'm gonna start seriously taking my ARE exams because it's something I've been kind of putting off. But it's really hard to do that while wedding planning. So I'm going to do that.
Fantastic. That's great. Awesome. I think that people can relate through personal or professional ambitions to whatever's coming in the future. So I think it's worthy of subscribing today. So thanks so much for joining me for this wonderful talk. It was lovely to meet you both, and wishing you all the best with the podcast and personal lives as well.
Thank you so much. This was so fun.
Yes, thanks for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.